Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, and welcome to episode 104 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. We got a great show for you today. We're going to be covering everything about a lot of different topics. We're going to be returning to our format of This Week in Bitcoin, This Week in Macro, and This Week in Geopolitics. But we're also going to do a fireside faster version of each one, because in part 4, I'm going to be covering an interview that I gave to mix up the format. So what are we going to be covering today? Well, episode 104 is obviously we are hitting the next phase of the US-China trade deal. And all the long-term listeners of Bitcoin Hard Talk will know that they haven't really been in a trade war. We've actually just been in a resetting of the world order for the proof of weapons network. But I'll make sure that everybody is aware. We got lots of new subscribers, 107,000 subscribers now. And I'm going to be sharing how the US-China trade war isn't what you think. And so in 4 parts, we're going to be doing This Week in Bitcoin. And I'm going to be really focusing on how Wall Street continues to fool Bitcoiners. Where are the real Bitcoiners? The ones that have been with me on this 14-year journey ever since $3, that know you should be holding it in self-custody rather than handing it over to Wall Street in order to give them more power while they reset the world order. We've been covering that and the latest on everything that's happening for all those Bitcoiners that are being fooled right now. The second section, part 2, This Week in Macro, we're going to be going through the controlled demolition of the PetroDollar. So as we are resetting the world order geopolitically, it has massive implications on the PetroDollar. So I'm going to make sure everybody is up to date on what's going on there. In part 3, we're going to be doing This Week in Geopolitics, where I'm going to be discussing why the media has suddenly switched gears and is focusing on turning Israel into a toxic asset, as we always said. Everybody that's a long-term listener won't be surprised. But why has the media suddenly switched to the long-term Sudan conflict? It started in 2019. We're now in 2025. Now, why is it getting attention right now? Well, we're going to be covering that in This Week in Geopolitics. And then finally, in part 4, we're going to head over to an interview that I gave with Danny of Capital Cosm. He did an interview with me, and we went really deeper into the proof of weapons network and making sure that you understood the building blocks, because we have new subscribers. I wanted to make sure. So let's dive right in with part 1. This Week in Bitcoin. Wall Street continues to fool Bitcoiners. So today is, in fact, 17 years ago today. Actually, the year I got married as well, 17 years. 2008 was the year that the Bitcoin white paper was released. October the 31st, 2008. 17 years ago on Halloween, the Bitcoin white paper was released and published. And if you hadn't watched last week's episode of Bitcoin Hard Talk 103, it was incredibly popular. We had 32,000 viewers on a 3-hour Bitcoin Hard Talk episode where we went through who Satoshi Nakamoto might be, the secret story that many don't know, as well as whether Bitcoin was actually a CIA operative. But it was 17 years ago that it was released to the Bitcoin cypherpunk mailing list. And last week, I went through the whole history with David Chom and Len Sassaman and Hal Finney and the various other characters and what led up to that, and the Bitcoin white paper as well. It wasn't until January 2009 that the first code was released. And when the first code was released, it had a version of the Times newspaper, the headline, "Banks on the Brink of Financial Disaster," as well as an image of the Israelis invading Gaza. So it's that was, 17 years ago. And look how far we come. And the Wall Street couldn't beat us. It was a mission, us versus the banks. And now the banks are in and persuading you to hold your Bitcoin with them. And so what's really been happening? Well, 2 million Bitcoins are locked up in Wall Street's coffers and held in custody. I'm ashamed of you Bitcoiners. Come on. We were here to take on the banks, not make the banks more powerful. And yet for your tax purposes and 401ks, you're falling for the old tricks and you're going to be borrowing against your Bitcoin. You're going to be mining some fiat currency. And with that fiat currency, you're going to be fueling the engines of the proof of weapons network, the debt-based Ponzi scheme, enslaving your fellow people in order to borrow some fiat currency against your Bitcoin. So Bitcoin treasury companies, the economic hitmen, the Wall Street financial terrorists have created financial weapons of mass destruction called Bitcoin treasury companies. And they have pumped and they have dumped. All the long-term listeners avoided the pump and dump cycle, but people are still falling for it. They're trying to get Wall Street's version of Bitcoin in a company where they essentially leverage debt in order to buy Bitcoin and sell equity to buy more Bitcoin. And Michael Saylor heading up the charge of accumulating as much Bitcoin for Wall Street as possible. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, all the financial terrorists, lending, creating products, they're loving it. And you're giving them and you're buying their MicroStrategy and MetaPlanet and Nakamoto and 21 or whatever the different names are of these over 100 different Bitcoin treasury companies, because you prefer giving your Bitcoin to somebody else so that they can hold it for you and you end up with a stock just because you're used to it. Empowering Wall Street. It's a journey. It's something that you need to, work towards. But already the financial terrorists at the S&P have already started to exert their influence. They're starting to flex their biceps. They're saying, hey, you Bitcoiners, we own that Bitcoin. And you, Michael Saylor, thank you for giving Wall Street all of that Bitcoin, pretending that you're original Bitcoiner, while all of these people follow you like an idol and give you their money over to you while we lend you some money so that you can buy some Bitcoin so that eventually we can control it. And just in case, Michael Saylor, you think you're bigger than your boots, you are a tool of Wall Street now. Once you go public with us, we own you. Once you borrow from our corporate bonds and debt structures, you are our debt slave. And you must do as I say. And so the S&P Global Ratings agencies decided we will put a B- credit rating on you. And if you do good by Wall Street, if you persuade more and more people to put their Bitcoin with you rather than us, then it will worship you with some debt enslavement money that we created because we have the ability to create the dollars, the part of our debt-based Ponzi scheme, and we'll give you a lovely credit rating. We may go above B-. We may decide once we've got enough Bitcoin in our ETF, once we decide to reset the world order and negotiate with the dollar, we may decide that we'll give you a B rating and maybe we'll go a little bit higher. But you have to be a good boy for the proof of weapons network. You have to mine lots of fiat currency. You have to persuade people to put their collateralized Bitcoin. You have to become a bank. You have to use it on your balance sheet. You have to lever it up as much time as possible. You have to fool people into debt-based Ponzi. You have to get them to borrow more riba, pay us more interest, mine more fiat currency, get that Bitcoin in our control, in our ETF, in our custody. Do not allow them to free themselves with their own Bitcoin. Do not allow them to be sovereign. Make sure that we control the Bitcoin. Thank you, Michael Saylor. 650,000 Bitcoin over to Wall Street and all the other cypherpunks that were even on the mailing list. Yes, I'm talking to you, Adam Back. Taking those 30,000 Bitcoin, swapping them for tax efficiency into some collateralized debt obligation, Nakamoto, whatever it is, different type of structure. And the financial terrorists like Howard Lutnick and his children at Cantor Fitzgerald, then their primary dealers as they roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. You contribute to that instead of owning your own Bitcoin. Anyway, I don't judge. I understand that there are very big reasons to do it. But I hope people understand the war that we're actually really in. It is proof of work, which is Bitcoin and self-custody, versus proof of weapons. And proof of weapons leverages debt and a debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to enslave in a K-shaped economy. We'll do a bit more of that in the macro section. So you are a tool for the proof of weapons network and Wall Street. Congratulations. But how much Bitcoin has BlackRock now got in the ETF? 800,000 Bitcoin. And he's laughing at you. Larry Fink is saying you will own nothing and be happy as we tokenize your ass. And you're going to be celebrating, thinking that the crypto decentralized blockchains are taking over the world. Little do you know, we are just using you as a tool to own your ass, build your social credit score, and turn you into a carbon credit default swap, collateralized debt obligation. And if you're lucky, we might give you some insurance and you can be happy and pay for it at the same time, while we're enslaving you with your 800,000 Bitcoin because you swapped it for a tokenized, financialized, securitized version. And don't worry, there's a reward for you. What did JP Morgan come out and do? JP Morgan said, hey, as long as you put your Bitcoin with BlackRock and hold it in custody with Coinbase, guess what? You can borrow against it. We'll give you some fiat currency loans. And so they're doing Bitcoin-backed and ETH-backed loans, but they're not backed by Bitcoin and ETH. They're backed by Bitcoin ETFs and ETH ETFs so that BlackRock can stake all of their ETH and they can gain control over the network. Fortunately, Bitcoin is proof of work because I'm not having much faith in all these people. 2 million Bitcoins you given to the proof of weapons network so they can hold it against you while they weaponize the dollar, reset the world. Hierarchy is as follows. If you are the CEO or the executive, you work for the board. The board is installed by the shareholders. The board works for the shareholders, and the shareholders are public companies. And so at the top of the proof of weapons network, by financializing and securitizing, you're able to create this structure whereby the asset managers can persuade you to put all your money with them, and then they get all the board seats, all the voting rights. And now they've created this proof of weapons network that has a structure and hierarchy that is greater than the US government, the UK government, the European government, while they enslave us as they push wars and debt slavery. And so Jamie Dimon had to come out and say, oh, God, you know, yes, crypto is going to change the world and it's all about blockchain. He couldn't say Bitcoin. He couldn't bring himself to say Bitcoin. And so he said JP Morgan is embracing crypto and specifically and noticeably didn't mention Bitcoin because he was crying. As BlackRock said, Jamie Dimon, step in gear. We need more Bitcoin. You are now a part of Bitcoin. And obviously, Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan, they have a lot of power on this hierarchy as well. But nothing is bigger than this proof of weapons network structure. And so as companies try to remain sovereign after suffering from war, after suffering from economic hitmen, after suffering from covert regime changes, they're fighting back and they're saying maybe, just maybe, our country could have some Bitcoin strategic reserves. So Brazil is announcing that they are looking to explore a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And we also had Germany's ADF, the alternative structure. Obviously, Merz is an implanted politician, and he is the chosen person of the proof of weapons network. And so Germany sold all their Bitcoin. But now the competitors are saying maybe we might buy some Bitcoin, and France is also exploring it. I'm sorry, Germany. I'm sorry, France, but you signed up to the European Union. You signed up to the European Central Bank, and they took away every ounce of sovereign decision-making that you had. You are now a tool for printing money via the European Central Bank and spending that money via NATO into propping up the US stock market so that they can engineer this pump and dump scheme so that the entrepreneurs can borrow against their stock, mine some fiat currency while the banks create all these dollars in a debt-based Ponzi scheme where there is not enough dollars to pay off all the dollars. And so therefore you need to roll over the debt scheme. And Ghana in Africa, realigning with BRICS, Brazil, aligning with BRICS, creating resistance against it, trying to create some resistance, has now become the 9th African country in order to adopt digital asset laws. So we'll see what happens as the Middle East align with the global South, backed by China, Russia, and BRICS, as they de-dollarize and we enter into the new world order that we have been discussing all along. Eventually, Bitcoin will be used. It will suck up all of that liquidity as currencies wars continues. It sponges up all of that liquidity like we're seeing in gold and Bitcoin right now. And then it becomes a negotiating tool. If enough of you useful idiots give it to Wall Street so you can make them more powerful as well. And what did we have? The US government beta tested a new confiscation. So this whole thing of Trump being the Bitcoin president and ushering in a Bitcoin strategic reserve has so far meant that he has mined some fiat currency, created a stable coin, and bought some Bitcoin with it, while his sons also mine some Bitcoin through a wrapped Ethereum network through shitcoin casinos and printing money and tokens like meme coins and NFTs and World Liberty Financial Utility tokens. You know, these have always been, crypto has always been a psyop to get your Bitcoin. That's what all the token issuers wanted in the first place. And the Trump administration is doing it. And US hasn't gained any Bitcoin. What are they doing? They are confiscating Bitcoin. So that if the proof of weapons network needs the Bitcoin, it can send the Bitcoin treasury companies into Chapter 11, make sure that it creates the network where you're borrowing against your Bitcoin, do a margin call, and it's got Michael Saylor as a useful node in the proof of weapons network. And it's also got the Trump administration. And it's also got the US government, which is now testing, confiscating another 100,000 Bitcoin. So it did another confiscation. And it will hold those. And it said, our strategy is to confiscate Bitcoin, much like in the 1930s, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, Wall Street engineered a pump and dump. The Federal Reserve was used in order to end up accumulating all those assets. And then they confiscated everyone's gold and made Americans hand over their gold. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but these are the types of schemes. And the US government is getting ready for confiscation. Now, what is happening on the other nodes of the proof of weapons network that are all shareholders in the Bank for International Settlements? Well, they're buying gold right now because the gold and the proof of weapons network are selling the dollar and they are selling their debt. What does that mean? Rather than in this, buying US treasuries, which requires them to buy dollars, they're now doing the trade in reverse. And you're getting more and more foreign governments and more foreign central banks that need to hedge out of the dollar trade. So central banks are selling, but who's buying? Well, the auctions are getting more and more distressed. We've covered that in the macro sections, but the new buyer is the new stable coins. And so now, as we said, Tether is the 17th largest purchaser of US debt. They're using the US debt in order to receive the yield. They get the yield and they buy Bitcoin. So who else is creating stable coins? World Liberty Financial, the Trump administration, they're launching their stable coin. The Trump administration needed to also pardon a very important stablecoin issuer because the Trump administration is doing deals with the Middle East and the GCC, as we've covered, and stablecoins are the mechanism for extracting wealth capital flows out of America and over to the tax-neutral jurisdictions. So one of the people that the Trump administration decided to pardon who will be launching their or returning to their stablecoin was CZ from Binance as well. What else did the Trump administration do? Well, they decided that it is time to get a new ballroom for the White House. So who paid for it? Tether, Coinbase, and Ripple Labs, 3 stablecoin issuers partnered with Circle in the case of Coinbase, also creating their own layer 2s. Ripple looking at creating their own stable coin on top of their blockchain, and Tether, the largest stablecoin issuers. So they had to wander over to the White House and say, we'll buy your ballroom. They transfer some money over to the Trump administration. They do a deal in the background to issue and mine some more stable coins. And lo and behold, they're going to be able to suck up some of that debt as the dump of debt gets put back onto the US. And it's all done via these Cayman Island structures if you look at who the biggest debt holders are. Now, in October this year, we were meant to get the announcement and launch of the beta test of the European Union central bank digital currency. I haven't seen it launched yet, but we did get an announcement from the European Union today that they are moving towards the digital euro. And by, I think they said 2029, they will be 100% central bank digital currency, digital euro. So what have I said all the years? I said that we're going to have a stablecoin standard surveillance state in America and a stablecoin standard across Europe. And that will be the mechanism for vassalizing and shrinking America into a regional power, all on the top of the proof of weapons network that controls and has fully vassalized the collective West at the moment. And so you can look by following the money in Bitcoin that we are clearly on a confiscation of Bitcoin standard. That may not happen, but clearly this is all about stable coins. This is all about getting as much Bitcoin inside Wall Street, because the Trump administration is obviously paid for by the technical industrial complex and the financial industrial complex. As we've always said, he's not a neocon, so it's anti-military industrial complex, but he has been doing everything he needs to do for the top of the power structure, which is the financial industrial complex, the asset managers, the private equity, the banks that mine and securitize and have bought the whole of America in the whole political process. So let's move on to part two. Part two, we're going to be covering this week in macro. And this week in macro, we're going to be covering a few topics. It's the controlled demolition of the petrodollar. And then we're going to be going into the trade wars, how all this fits together, and some of the transitions that we're seeing in this world of Bitcoin AI and central bank digital currencies and the layoffs that we are experiencing. So just as a recap, for those that are not familiar with the petrodollar, it was an important mechanism for perpetuating the debt-based Ponzi scheme. After World War I and World War II, we entered into the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system says everybody trade against our currencies. Forget about gold. It will be tradable for dollars, and those dollars will be convertible into gold. And over time, they had, after the Proof of Weapons Network created the Korean War, the Cold War, the Vietnamese War, all of the other wars, the Middle Eastern wars and everything. In 71, they defaulted on their promise when France sent ships to try and get some of their gold and said, nah, you're not going to have your gold anymore. I know we got all the British gold from the British Empire, all the German gold from the Nazi regime, all of the Russian gold from the creation of the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution. We ended up with about 70% of the gold, but these Vietnamese wars and the Federal Reserve, which is owned by the banks, they decided to collateralize it. And so we confiscated all the gold in the 30s off our people. And in the end, we decided that there's still not enough gold. So we'll close the gold window. We'll have our 8,000 odd tons in reserve. We'll allow the Fed to collateralize against it. And then we'll have this double bookkeeping process that Trump said he was going to audit, but he didn't audit. Now, one of the real important mechanisms after creating the IMF and the economic hitmen in order to fuel covert wars around the world, destroy currencies, turn countries into central bank debt-based Ponzi schemes that would perpetuate dollar debt, and then use financial weapons of mass destruction and covert warfare in order to get the world addicted to dollar debt, they needed to co-opt various countries in the Middle East. And obviously, the British Empire was the evil at the time. The Saudis decided, we don't want to work with the evil Brits, we'll work with the Americans. And they said, you can help us mine this oil. And the mines, they said, well, we want 50% in perpetuity. Saudi over time said, hey, that's a bad deal. We're propping up the dollar here. We'll price this oil in dollars, and then we'll build our own dollar reserves. And with those dollar reserves, we'll lend them to the US government. And then you can provide us with weapons and various other things on the Proof of Weapons Network. And this was the petrodollar. And it worked very well for a long time. But there was a slight hindrance. And that was that China would be a rising power. America would end up oil independent, so it's no longer the customer. And then Saudi would use its sovereign wealth that it had built up in order to acquire power over the Western empires. And now it has, with the financial industrial complex and the Proof of Weapons Network, the Gulf countries are co-investing in every deal, own more and more power in the West, but China's paying the bill and China's the customers. And it's the one that pays the bill you have to align with. And so the petrodollar has slowly gone down from 100% petrodollar to 30% petro yuan and 70% petrodollar. And we're having this managed transition as the Saudis aligned with GCC and BRICS and various other things that we'll cover in the geopolitical section. So anyway, this lasted for 40 years. Now the Gulf countries have built up about $5 trillion of wealth through the petrodollar. And what they needed to do was sell oil in dollars with those dollars, so that creates the demand for dollars, but then they need to keep the debt-based Ponzi going. So they take their dollars and they'd buy US treasuries, which is lending it to the US government. They would receive a yield, and then they would use that in order to essentially import inflation. So, as world reserve currency, America got to export its inflation. It had the special privilege of being able to borrow from anyone. And that obviously creates all this inbound investment, and that creates liquidity in the capital markets. And then you have all these financial weapons of mass destruction that were built. In exchange, Saudi gets to buy from the military industrial complex. So you essentially have them buying, pricing oil in dollars. That creates the demand for dollars. That is then purchased treasuries, which then brings back yield, and it creates like a syringe out of American industry where the yield goes back to the investor, just like the banks, because they were doing it with actual resources as opposed to a dollar loan in the first place, which is what the IMF was trying to push. And then they would spend it back into the military industrial complex. The price of those financial stocks, technical stocks, military stocks would all go up, and it would have this constant flow of new liquidity while Saudi is building and building those reserves and their sovereign wealth. But then they needed to peg their currency to the dollar. That requires having these dollars in demand in order to maintain the peg. So they have their local currency, which needs to remain pegged to the US dollar. So what is happening now? Well, now that we are resetting the world order into this multipolar world, the proof of weapons network and the sovereign wealth and the central banks are all pivoting towards gold. They're looking for a liquidity sponge in order to park their money while the world order gets reset, and they strategically weaken the dollar and manage and hedge their capital flows while they resolve all these conflicts that they create and try and get as much power as well. And so the peg is now really, really expensive in a weakening dollar environment, because historically, China has weakened their currency and America has strengthened their currency, because America has been consuming on debt and exporting the dollar. This is why they're $38 trillion in debt. The Saudis and the Gulf countries have been accumulating and building their sovereign wealth based upon their resources, and China built the manufacturing base and wants to keep their currency low in order to make their exports cheaper. But every single barrel of oil that is now sold outside the dollar, which is approximately 30%, and there may be a lot more, because obviously this network has created a shadow financial system as a result of de-dollarization, where essentially China has now built a whole system for circumventing sanctions with Iran and Russia, where they can trade with each other and they can order goods based upon holding yuan reserves, and some of those yuan reserves then get rolled over into gold. But if you have a weakening dollar rather than a strengthening dollar, then this becomes a drain to the Gulf central banks, because they're not a traditional central bank. They're not a central bank that is like in the, a member of the bank. They are members of Bank for International Settlements. However, they're not creating their debt-based Ponzi scheme and handing over for financial, their central bank is not owned by the private banks. So China has a state banking system owned by the People's Bank of China. The Gulf countries have it backed by their sovereign wealth, and America's Federal Reserve is owned by the banks. So all the dollar creation benefits the banks, and the everyday Americans end up with the inflation, and that creates that K-shaped economy I've always talked about. But the banks, essentially, the Gulf central banks, when they've gotten these dollars through pricing oil in the dollar, they need to basically either sell some of their gold to prop up the peg in a weakening dollar environment, or they need to draw down on their treasury reserves and their treasury holdings by selling their treasuries and buying dollars. And so this becomes a drain in reverse in order to keep the peg. So this is going to need to transition, because they're essentially doing the reverse. It's called the dollar milkshake theory, essentially, where everybody in a strengthening dollar environment is lending to the US government. Well, that is now working in reverse. So this means that they're burning their gold reserves. And this is just to defend the peg in order to remain pegged to the dollar. But who are the customer of the Middle East? It's no longer America. America is energy independent. In fact, they compete with the Gulf countries right now because they're exporting gas and oil. So eventually, as we float into this multipolar basket, as we're seeing with the petro yuan, you'll also see with the petro ruble and the petro rupee and various other in this multipolar world, they decided that BRICS is not going to be a currency anymore because they knew that that was going to be an attack by Goldman Sachs to do what they did to the European Union under the single currency. So the US debt to GDP ratio is about 125% right now. It is set to reach approximately 140%. It's now at $38 trillion, and growth is not keeping up with it. All of the money is propping up the financial industrial complex through the amount of Medicare and Medicaid and all these different schemes that are promised to allow the asset managers to manage all that money. Then you've got the interest on the debt, and then you got defense. But the defense always goes back into propping up the stock market in the proof of weapons network. And so there is no political path to balance and pay down the debt. Why? Because the dollar is debt. If you pay down the 38 trillion like Elon Musk was pretending to do, while instead he ended up getting all the AI algorithm data for the Department of Government Efficiency for the military industrial complex and technical industrial complex, you realize that you can't. And so we entered into the debt ceiling increasing, the big, beautiful bill, and tariff policy that reset the world order, as we'll be covering in the China-Trump trade war. So there is no political solution to balance the books. That would be mass austerity. It would create, it would essentially destroy $38 trillion of dollars. And there's not enough debt to pay the system because it's a debt-based Ponzi scheme. So now we've hit the stage where the interest payments on the debt is on par with defense spending, which is approximately $1 trillion. And the Fed has already given signals that they won't monetize deficits forever. They're not going to do it indefinitely, which means that the Fed needs to pivot to the fiscal dominant strategy. And who does Trump administration work for? The same thing that the Biden administration worked for. Their lobby. Who are their lobby? The financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, technical industrial complex. Trump's biggest contributor was Elon from tech and military, and also the Bank of New York Mellon family, and also Adelson, the Israeli policy as well. But the Gulf came in with alternative money, and through Jared Kushner created a fund for Trump in order to reset the world order. We'll cover that in the geopolitical section anyway. So the Fed said we're not going to do it indefinitely because the Fed, when it decides to reset the world order for the banks, when there's no more leverage, they get to just go on their own path, reset the order, and start pricing financial products in alternative currencies as the financial industrial complex and proof of weapon network is doing right now. And so what have they got left? Well, they can take the vassal states and ask them to buy the debt. So who is the largest holder of debt? Is Japan and UK. And so UK, which is broke, which is just essentially, in its own debt crisis, it is being forced to continue to hold that debt, but eventually they'll need to sell those assets. And what is Japan doing? Japan's aligning to the right because the tariff policy reset the world order and got everyone to align with the BRICS corridors and the GCC corridors and shrink America into regional only. And so obviously Trump has been around Asia, repairing the relationship with Japan. He had a meeting with Xi Jinping, and he also met Malaysian president and the Indonesian president in order to set those orders, which is the ASEAN blocks as well. So what is left? Well, who is the largest purchaser of the US debt right now? Cayman Islands. Who is Cayman Islands? Americans. Americans that are contributing to their pension, their endowments, their university college fees, their student loans, and all of the pension funds and various other things. So they're dumping the debt on you. They're dumping it onto stable coins, which is, again, all of these dumping the treasuries onto the American people while they sell out, while the foreign countries sell and buy gold. Now, what do they need to do? They also need to roll over the debt. That means the long-term debt is driven by market forces. The rates on 10-year and 30-year treasuries, they've come down a bit, but they're, kind of at their 5% range, 4 to 5% range at the moment. That is what determines credit card debt, mortgage debt, auto loan debt. But short-term debt is where America wants to refinance. So Trump obviously put his shadow Fed governors in, who work for the financial industrial complex anyway. And so anyway, they have to force the debt at lower rates to subsidize the demonetization. So not only do they want the Americans to own it, but they want the cheapest yield possible as well. So by putting down short-term rates, you can roll over the debt every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks at a lower rate, and you can force the Fed just to push those rates down. What else did the Fed announce? So we got rate cuts, and then they announced the end of quantitative tightening. This is full vassalization. So the end of quantitative tightening means that we move closer to the quantitative easing cycle. Now, what do you need? You need justification to take on all of that debt by government. So the government gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but it is the banks and the American people that are issuing the loans. The banks have already got the high interest bonds, and now they want to sell the cheap interest bonds to the American people by backing it through their stable coins. And so what is Trump doing? Fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance means nothing stops this train. Debt at all cost. And so if you are looking to renegotiate where the debt goes, you shut down the government, you control through lobby both the Democrats and the Republicans, and you negotiate through the power structure where all the politicians say, hey, I'll pretend that we'll do this for the American people, but I'll get you this money. And that's where we're witnessing right now. You've got the government shut down where they bribe, Trump got the debt ceiling up to $5 trillion, got the big, beautiful bill. And now all the lobbies get to negotiate with each other in order to steal the money from the American people, which is inflationary. And you get to essentially roll over the debt through fiscal dominance, which means the government becomes bigger and bigger, but they're vassalized into these financial weapons of mass destruction anyway. So what is your options from here when you do this fiscal dominance? Well, because the lobbies are in charge, they're going to get all the money to pump up the stock market so they can borrow against their stock with 0% money, which is the financial industrial complex playbook. That's how they control all the executives and board seats by saying, look, we'll give you share options and you can borrow against your stock. We'll let you be as wealthy as you want. We'll give you 0% money through quantitative easing programs. And then we get to pump that into your stock prices as long as you do as we say. And so you can either, the options from here is you can either slash domestic programs, i.e., some of the pension programs, some of the Medicare, some of the those different types of programs. And you need to persuade the private sectors and funds to basically buy treasuries at below market rates, which is why they're looking to slash those interest rates, roll over the debt, and who's buying them? Is your pension. And so you get the lower rates at the same time, which means that it's harder for you to combat inflation. And so they need to take further and further risk. Now, that's one option that you can follow. Another option is you can just let it inflate away and erode all the debt and all of the currency's value, which is what is exactly happening with fiscal dominance. Now, both of those will be catastrophic for any company that is essentially, tied their company to the dollar. And so what are the companies doing that are preparing? That's why we're getting gold, silver, Bitcoin, and various others. And, this is reverse dollar dominance in this managed transition. And so this is why we're seeing essentially America shrink from the global reserve currency into a regional currency only. And the beneficiary of that is going to be the proof of weapons network, because they own all the assets and they've got the high yielding debt while you get the low yielding debt. That creates the inflation. And so they get to erode away their debt, weaken the dollar, that gets those capital outflows. And that's why we're seeing a radical change in the geopolitical situation right now. This is what's causing the rise in the power of those sovereign wealth blocks. And so that is represented by the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Gulf countries, and the BRICS countries. And so what this does is it ends the privilege of America being able to borrow from the world. And that ends some of the productivity. And the narrative that you need to be told is that this is about rebuilding the manufacturing base. But how's that really going to happen? It can only happen if you can compete with the labor market of China and the commodity market of China. But China's got the resources, the rare earth minerals that are needed for the technical industrial complex and the military industrial complex. So the financial industrial complex is using tariff policies in order to make sure that they're hedging their bets and working with China, working with BRICS, working with the GCC. And so, as I said, the China and US trade war, this gets us to the main topic that we wanted to cover. If you're a long-term listener or a new listener, you'll know that I said there was no trade war. China had already won. This was just simply a reset of the world order into multipolarity. It allows small businesses which pay, because remember, America has to, by having world reserve currency, have a twin deficit, which is import more than it exports, and spend more with a trade deficit and a fiscal deficit. That's the rules of world reserve currency in a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, the K-shaped economy is going. And that's the China-US trade war, essentially. Now, what did it do? It meant because America is the importer and China's the exporter, with the exception of, say, soybeans, which is why you get announcement. China said, okay, we'll buy some of your farmers' soybeans and we'll pay the tariffs on there. But your companies are paying all of our tariffs. And so the higher the tariff rate, it's only the large multinational corporations that have sites on both sides in China and America that are able to play that trade and not pay it. Only the domestic American companies pay the tariff because they import, they have to pay the higher price. So it's a tax on small to medium-sized business in America, which then get acquired through M&A into the larger multinational corporations. They acquire all the export-dependent countries that have been vassalized by the proof of weapon network as well. But they drive everyone closer to BRICS, which is where Trump and all the proof of weapons network are investing their money as well, where the birth rates are going up. So then you get the announcement, China, you get these pump and dumps in the stock market, obviously, because the proof of weapons network is negotiating. It's not negotiating for America. It's negotiating for the banks and multinationals. And they're negotiating against sovereign countries like China. And then they have these different deals. And we get an announcement. And obviously, because BlackRock and the hedge funds and the private equity funds, they're on the other side of the negotiations. Any movements in the market, they're able to either destroy their competition if they're on the inside track and profit from it and hedge from it as we get these wild swings in the market. So you get an announcement that they're reigniting the trade war. Then we get an announcement that it's settled. And then soon enough, we'll get whatever the remnants of the quote unquote trade deal is. So what did we get as an announcement this week? We got, number one, that there was reduced fentanyl tariffs to 10%, which is effective immediately. Now, the whole drug war is narrative because the military industrial complex is retreating from the Middle East. They're not going to be making the profits they could have made in the Asia Pacific. And so now they're coming after Europe and Latin America. And so when you're coming after Latin America and your neighbors, you need a narrative to come after Mexico, Canada, and Venezuela and all the other parts in the region. And that's the drug narrative. Even though, as if you're a long-term listener, you follow the money and you know the CIA is the drug trafficking network for the black op operations of the deep state, which is a subset of the financial industrial complex and military industrial complex in order to perpetuate the debt dollar slavery. And so you immediately get these escalations in wars. And so this is useful for the narrative, saying China is drugging our people, when we know that was the British Empire via the Opium Wars. They're using that narrative, saying, is China doing us to the Americans? The MAGA people love it, think we're making America great again, when really they're just paying tax on their CIA network that is doing all the drug trafficking, and they get to fund the next war with their neighbors. What is the second thing that they announced? They said the overall tariffs on China are going to be reduced from 57% to 47%, and the 100% tariff won't happen. 47% is enough to send medium-sized businesses in America bankrupt and create that inflationary cycle. And the only way you can offset that inflationary cycle is through something deflationary, i.e. getting the price of oil down or artificial intelligence and robotics. But that creates unemployment. And so unemployment becomes the next focus of manipulation as well as inflation. You've got these inflationary forces and these unemployment forces, which gives all the narrative needed to cut the rates down so that you can roll over the short-term debt and dump it on your pension and sell it to your pension as well. What is the third thing that they're doing? China is going to discuss chip restrictions with NVIDIA. Essentially, NVIDIA needs to sell their chips to China. They're now a $5 trillion company, the first $5 trillion company. Apple became a $4 trillion company. You've got the technical industrial complex. They had wild fluctuations in their share price. We had a crash from Meta, a crash. I think we had a pump from Google, a pump from, comment we had a pump or a crash from Amazon. And then we had basically all of the Magnificent Seven, wild swings based upon the different types of, earnings and expectations that they were going through. So really, the NVIDIA side is important. Now, China's saying we got our own chips. Now, America's saying we need to create war and pretend that you're going to reunify with Taiwan. We know that you'd rather have business as usual, but we always need to justify it and make sure that we print our $1 trillion, get Japan in debt, Philippines in debt, Taiwan in debt, so that we can sell more weapons, even though we have zero military power ability in that side of the region. We've only got our local region. But we need to continue that narrative. But we want you to buy chips from NVIDIA. China's saying we've got our own. We would like to, your sanctions that you placed upon TSMC and Taiwan, they're kind of not working. We're still able to play in the AI arms race. And so Trump is saying, no, we want you to buy because we want you to pay some of the tariffs, which is the real thing that this is about. The artificial intelligence chips. What do these artificial intelligence chips require? They require rare earth minerals. And so that is really the most important part. The Belt and Road Initiative has been partnering with Africa, Middle East around their resources, and now China's the main customer rather than America. And so they got a monopoly on these rare earth minerals. And so there was never going to be a trade war because America cannot create a weapon without China. And they can't even create their military program without enriched uranium that they import from Russia. And Europe isn't sanctioning oil because they need Russia's oil, but America's just making them buy some more oil and gas from them in order because they are vassal states and they installed their presidents. And that's why the sanctions on Russia are in fact sanctions on Europe, because Russia's got its alternative routes because they did the de-dollarization, which was the purpose of the Ukraine Russia escalation in the first place. So they said that there's no more obstacles to rare earth minerals. So they're all flowing because they have to. And finally, the fifth thing they said is that China and US are going to collaborate on solving Ukraine. Now, that won't happen. They may collaborate, but we know that Europe has $1 trillion to print, $350 billion to take from Russia, that NATO is going to spend into propping up the US stock market, which helps the military-industrial complex. So they need to keep the narrative of defending democracy. But China and US eventually, when they are ready to end the Ukraine war, once Europe is fully vassalized, once Russia owns most of Ukraine and has those rare earth minerals, and once America for BlackRock has the contracts, then they will announce that Ukraine is over, and it will be Xi Jinping and Trump that will make that announcement in order to pump the stock markets to reset the world order, while the average American, European, and Brit struggle like crazy. And so what are we getting right now? Well, the large companies, they're announcing layoffs. Now, you can attribute this in two ways. You can either say efficiency improvements because of artificial intelligence and robotics, which I think a large part is attributed to, or you could say the economy is bad. And I think it's efficiency improvements because the stock market's doing incredibly well. The economy is doing bad. And so pick your pill, really, decide. But we got announcements in the last few weeks that UPS is laying off 40,000 employees. Amazon is laying off up to 30,000 employees. Intel, 24,000 employees, even after getting a subsidy from the government so that they can hedge against Taiwan manufacturing semiconductor company, TSMC, as well. Nestle, which is a big one in the consumer industrial complex, as well as Amazon, laying off 16,000 jobs. Accenture, 11,000 jobs. Ford, 11,000 jobs. Novo Nordisk, 9,000 jobs. Microsoft, 7,000 jobs. PwC, 5,600 jobs. Now ChatGPT can do a better consulting job. Salesforce, 3,000 jobs. Paramount, 2,000 jobs. Now that artificial intelligence can create a better film. Target, 1,800 jobs. Now everybody's buying on Amazon. Kroger, 1,000 jobs. And Applied Materials, 1,440 jobs. And Meta, 600 jobs. So those are the announcements that we've had as well. At the same time, the US and the EU, they continue to prepare what I call for civil unrest. The European war is working. It's turned Europe into a complete vassal state. And across America and across Europe, they're engineering the constructs with the technical industrial complex through Palantir, the military industrial complex that is adjusting to cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, and vassalization through cheap acquisitions of assets between JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, KKR, Blackstone, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. What are they doing? They're acquiring all of the assets that they need across Europe, across UK, and across America, and even, of course, across Israel as well. We started to see bankruptcies of the largest steel company in Israel as a result of the Turkey sanctions. And of course, they're highly likely the UAE and the Gulf countries will come in order to acquire those assets. Across America, they got the privatized prison sector subsidizing ICE, the privatized military that gets paid for every deportation, every incarceration. We had nodes in the media network, like Laura Loomer, who was sending Sami Hundi to prison, pretending that they're Muslim Brotherhood in order to create these racial tensions and push the whole Jews rule the world, Muslims invasion narrative, which is manufacturing civil unrest, pretending that open border, closed border, mass deportations isn't a way of actually deploying military across the country, because they know that when things get rough in the K-shaped economy, the ICE will be needed in order to control the American people as well, as they're beta testing across the UK. And so you're having mass incarcerations. You're having the surveillance state built up further and further. You're having beta tests of digital IDs in UK. You're having central bank digital currencies. And you're having social credit scores across our X platform where they gave us freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. All of that is to build together the surveillance state because they know that the biggest risk, as the tools that were used by the proof of weapons network on the global south, on Latin America, on the Middle East, on Africa, on Asia countries, is now coming home to make up for lost profits. And so the tools of war are all coming home, which I say, when you combine this manufactured decline of the dollar with hedging strategies and the extraction of wealth through the largest capital market, you have essentially the decline, the managed decline of the West and the rise of other regions, which creates opportunities for other regions, which is why we're starting to see conflicts that are starting to resolve between others. And hence, this is why we got the ceasefire in Gaza, because the military is exiting, which Netanyahu is a node of using Israel. And instead, Israel is no longer important because the financial industrial complex works with the Gulf countries, taking out the need for Israel, and therefore the subsidy of the Pentagon budget, because it won't be spent back into propping up the US stock market, because the Gulf countries are signing deals direct between Qatar and US, between Saudi, and even hedging with other regions like Pakistan and China and Russia. And so we're having those new agreements signed. And because that's happening, we now need to reset the narrative slightly, which brings us into the topic that I'll be covering in part 3 this week in geopolitics. Why is the media all of a sudden, even though the conflict started in 2019 and there's a big history, this week in geopolitics, why is the media now focusing on the Sudan conflict? So let's jump in with part 3 this week in macro. Why is the media focusing on the Sudan conflict now? And this will be the final section. By the way, if you're enjoying this, please do like, share, retweet. We've got 107,000 subscribers now. We've got 2 sections. In part 3, we'll go through this week in geopolitics focused on Sudan. And then we're going to be going through my interview on the Proof of Weapons Network. For those of you that missed the interview, I think it got 60,000 views on Danny's channel. And we'll go through what I'll be covering for the final section. Okay, so throughout the last couple of years, we've been covering the Gaza-Israel genocide. Because the military didn't win in the negotiation, and they didn't manage to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and chuck them into Jordan and Egypt and into the Sinai, Jordan and Egypt signed a new alliance with the GCC, essentially. The GCC had normalization through China with Iran, and Iran stopped back in the Axis, and Qatar, which was the funder, look, Iran is the boogie monster. They say that they're funding all the Axis. Qatar was doing that, but Qatar is a US ally with a US base. And then I talked about how we had the 12-day, we had October the 7th, which was nothing like it was covered. But that was essentially a false flag operation. It did happen, but it was to set the conflict. Then we entered into the 12-day war, which was a theater to give everyone their narrative. And then finally, we entered into the Doha, where Israel struck on Qatar. And I said that would reset the game and be the catalyst for the next stage. You can go back to any of my old blogs. I created a blog on that. I think it was on the 12th of September when I was covering it live. And that did actually mark the change. So now we're at the ceasefire. I said Israel doesn't rule the world, but they'll manage the divorce between US and Israel. You had people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, now even Nick Fuentes is going on these shows in order to make Americans hate Jews because of what happens, because they're saying you control the world. And so therefore we need to free ourselves. And America gets to have the plausible deniability from the genocide. And then essentially the Gulf countries get to acquire all of the assets in Israel. And then Gaza gets to be rebuilt and the Levant gets restructured with a US exit under the control of the Gulf Cooperation Council, who has normalized with Iran via their BRICS partnership. So what are the next steps that we're expecting in the Gaza conflict? So the ceasefire, obviously there has been few little hiccups there, here and there, but I'm not expecting this to turn to the Greater Israel Project. The Greater Israel Project, aka the Greater American Military Industrial Complex Project, is essentially over, but we've got to have this managed transition to regional stability. So there'll be hiccups along the way, but once you get the independent Arab security within Palestine, that's it. We have entered a new era. Once that happens, which is the final, next step that we're trying to get to, it will probably be Egypt and Jordan and Turkey that have their military ready, and some GCC factions. Once they are there, instead of Israeli occupation, the occupation is over, the genocide is over, which was propping up the dollar by stopping the Middle East unify around their resources and work with China and BRICS. We enter into that new world order. This is an event the size of the fall of the Berlin Wall in terms of impact. This really marks the end of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order and the managed decline of the dollar that we covered in part 2. So once you have the security in, you'll get regime change within Hamas, because Hamas is no longer needed, because it will actually be an independent Palestine under the Palestinian Authority, most likely with a GCC puppet government, not an Israeli or US puppet. I'm expecting regime change within Israel as well, where you'll get the Smotrich and the Gavirs. They're looking like they're going to go crazy. They're not going to listen to America and all that stuff. But eventually it will lead to a destabilization campaign and the change of Israel to, rather than working for the US military industrial complex, working for regional stability with the Gulf countries. They will privatize all of the nationalized assets. More of them will go bankrupt and they will be acquired by Gulf countries. And they'll be able to have a financial rails, energy rails, trade routes that will be unified across the region, and will enter into this regional stability era that really has never been able to happen since the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the installation of Sykes-Picot by the French and British Empire. And so the Levant will be essentially economically vassalized. Again, I'm not saying what I want to happen. I'm not saying what is just. I'm saying that by following the money, this is what I think is going to happen. And the deal will hold. There'll be hiccups along the way. There'll be, any militias. They'll be integrated or eliminated. But nothing stops this train in terms of the region being unified around regional stability as well. Okay. I said there was actually an interesting announcement from one of the major Israeli steel firms. They went into bankruptcy after Turkey basically sanctioned the company. That cost massive financial, and you'd expect a bailout probably from UAE, which is playing good cop, and Saudi, which is playing bad cop, and Qatar, which is really US allied, and they're playing, and also working with BRICS as well. So what does this actually do? This essentially, after we get these bailouts, I think slowly over time, you get a two-state solution that moves to something that looks more like a one-state solution that eventually looks like Arab majority. And you just have what Palestine was, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews all lived in peace together. It was Arab majority. Before the colonial expeditions and the military-industrial complex recruited a useful idiot army called the IDF in order to destabilize the region. And so that really, really does make a difference. And so I'd expect more acquisitions and announcements to follow as Israel's debt to GDP goes up. And then, basically, if the Gulf sovereign wealth says, right, I'm not going to invest in that AI deal, but I'm going to invest in China's AI, or I'm going to reduce the petrodollar slightly and increase the yuan dollar slightly, they get all the leverage in order to negotiate those relationships. And they sit between BRICS and the regional empire of America, which would just be regional control. As I said, it will control Canada, Mexico, Latin America, Central America, Europe, those different, its neighbors essentially. And so anyone that is a neighbor of the proof of weapons network, sorry, it's not going to be good. Anybody that is an exiting neighbor of the US military, it's going to be good. And China's going to be investing. GCC's going to be investing. There will definitely be predatory deals, but by nature, it's not regime change because that's not the goal. The goal is not to change how they govern in order to have neoliberalism. And then with neoliberalism, you get financialization and securitization, which then leads to control, currency warfare, IMF debt, and dollar dependency. That model is over. And watch part 2 if you want to see how that happens. And essentially, the proof of weapons network is leveraging and now needs to escalate media to give itself more attention because there is a new negotiation. The new negotiation is that once you get the Gulf countries, Jordan, Egypt, in Palestine, the deal is the deal. And so before you get there, let's take attention away from what Israel is doing. It gets to weaken them as a pariah state, but also put attention on what UAE is doing. So enter Sudan. If you hadn't noticed, there's been a big uptick in the media of covering what's happening in Sudan. And what is happening in Sudan is a humanitarian crisis. But it made it to the United Nations. There was protests outside UK, and there was coverage on Qatar-sponsored media like Al Jazeera. And that made it to Western media. Now, Western media, plus Al Jazeera, plus United Nations, plus protests in the UK and across Europe, that means that this is an operation to bring attention to what's happening in Sudan. Not because it's a humanitarian crisis, but because of the political leverage, which implies to me, just like in Gaza, that we're about to reset that order. Because with the Gulf countries, they're going to need to they're going to need to manage their relationship, because where does China get all their rare earth? They get it from Africa and various other Asian countries, and of course the resources of the Middle East. And so they're in effect handing over, BRICS is handing over through this partnership with the GCC, effective control of the negotiations with the Western Hemisphere and the Proof of Weapons Network. And in the Proof of Weapons Network, looking to gain leverage, it needs to ruin UAE's reputation. So media brings attention, but doesn't give the full details. So what is happening in Sudan? Now, there is a big history, but in order to follow the money, you just need to understand the flows that are happening in the current version of what's happening. Because the past was always based upon regional dominance by the West, which would extract for 800 years all of Africa's resources in order to get those vital components for the technical industrial complex, Apple, electric vehicles, batteries, all of the things that were needed. But in 2019, there was a coup, which was backed by UAE, of a organization called RSF. Now, the difference between RSF and then the other side of that is SAF, which is the existing Sudanese power structure. The coup was attempted, backed by the UAE, but it was an internal struggle. And so that internal struggle already existed. So it wasn't like the West, where they fund ISIS and Al-Qaeda and then get them to destabilize a country so that they can steal the resources and then create religious tensions and say, hey, we now need to put strikes in Somalia, for example, because we're pretending we're coming after ISIS, which was funded by the West. This one was actually a genuine internal struggle. So you had an attempted coup in 2019, and that was essentially the RSF. Now, it's not an external militia, it's internal, but it is supported by. And this makes UAE look incredibly bad because they want to control the resources between China and the West so that the West can exit. Remember, the West is negotiating their exit. And so they would have extended that to rare earth minerals, China, and the power struggle between the GCC sitting in the middle between this multipolar world. And so if you can draw lots of media attention to the crimes against humanity that are happening in Sudan, then you get negotiation leverage using the United Nations. Now, what is the other side, the SAF? Who are they backed by? Well, they got support from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So within the GCC, you can be on the other side of a power struggle, but still unified around regional stability. And my prediction is there's probably going to be, like the Gaza conflict, a year, 2 years, I don't know, however long it's going to be, but we're going to move towards probably, segregation, a separatist movement. And I doubt maybe, RSF, there should be trialed for their crimes against humanity. Whether it happens or not is another thing. But essentially, you got Egypt backing the SAF, the Sudanese government, and then you've got a separatist movement, militia, which is committing crimes against humanity, the RSF, which is backed by UAE. I'm expecting this to come to an end eventually as part of this managed negotiation. And so why is this attention happening right now? Remember, UAE gaining power is not in the interest in the negotiation of the proof of weapons network. The proof of weapons network owns the US, so it doesn't care about America, but it does care about access to resources so that it can control the routes when it wants to launch its currency wars, just like the banks are doing it with Bitcoin, the central banks are doing it with gold. The other side is the resources, and the Saudis and Qatar and the GCC have got the PetroDollar and the yuan dollar. The rare earth minerals for semiconductor chips and batteries are the resources that are important in the negotiation between the proof of weapons network and China. Remember, Trump is negotiating for corporate interests, not for America, and China is negotiating for its country's interest because it's got a system where the money is recycled into its own people rather than for corporate interest through the debt-based Ponzi scheme because the Fed is owned by the banks. So this is an alternative to UAE legacy model or the US model. So if UAE does not do this, US would be doing this. And it looks like US are testing this structure as part of the GCC negotiations of handing over to UAE and GCC. And so I'm looking for what comes next and what types of deals, and I'll continue to follow the money. But it gives the proof of weapons network via US, via United Nations, the ability to gain some moral credibility by blame shifting over to the crimes against humanity that UAE is committing versus what's happening with Israel in the Gaza side. So the US is okay with any outcome at this stage because the US is not acting in America's interest. It's acting in the proof of weapons network, which is the CEO of BlackRock, which wants a multipolar world order. So that power structure through the lobby comes down. But we got a massive increase in the narrative of basically it was saying the UAE is committing genocide in order to steal gold. That's kind of the narrative that's being perpetuated. And so because the UAE supported the coup in 2019 and probably supports factions, but we don't know to what extent, remember that this is supported by a global power structure. This is a US, France, Europe exit at the same time as Russian imperialism, at the same time as China and their rare earth minerals Belt and Road Initiative empire. So if you look at what's really happening, you had UAE that backed the coup. You had China that has been arming the RSF through the China weapons. And you've had Chad, which used to be aligned with America and is now aligned with Russia, that has been sending their militias and mercenaries in order to give RSF the power that they have been taking. Now, these militias and mercenaries have been committing horrible crimes against humanity. And obviously, if you can blame it all on UAE, that ties into the negotiations right now. Why? Because what is the UAE traditional structure? Well, for decades, or not for decades, for a long time, gold has already been sold to Kenya. And so the gold is not utilized for Sudan. All resources are stolen, and that has propped up the Kenya side, which is why we're seeing some of the regime changes and colored revolutions within Kenya at the moment. All of these relationships I expect over the years ahead in Africa to be resolved, to work with the GCC and to be funded by BRICS China Belt and Road Initiative as we get these US exits, which is the important of the trade negotiations, rare earth minerals, of everything we're seeing right now as America becomes a regional power. And so the gold that has been stolen from Sudan has actually been sold in the souks, in the markets in Dubai. Now, that is actually by Sudanese people quite often. And so it's going direct from gold being extracted, sold in the Dubai markets to the souks, but there's no evidence that it's going on to the sovereign wealth fund of Dubai itself. So this structure for selling gold and the Kenyan structure has gone on for a while. But obviously, you can change the narrative and you can say UAE is committing a genocide in order to steal the gold so that the sovereign wealth can build up their supplies at the moment. Now, I'm not absolving UAE because I think they should personally completely back out of this. I think it's making them looking incredibly bad. But obviously, they've had negotiations based upon their US exit in the region. So there are things behind the scenes that we can't possibly know. Obviously, the nuance is not coming out. And so the narrative of the proof of weapons network says, let's focus on Sudan right now to increase the leverage as well. So the GCC wants to be between BRICS and US. That is happening. The proof of weapons network gets to leverage the US and the Middle East in order to give more power to the corporate interest. But they are engineering the rise of the Middle East and the rise of Africa because Africa still has the highest birth rates in the world, while they put America in the East on artificial intelligence and robotics, and they negotiate their partnerships with the sovereign wealth funds to co-invest through the financial industrial complex. All of this to say is that hopefully we're going to witness the end of the Gaza conflict soon. There are still crimes against humanity still being committed. And the trigger we need is when we see that Jordanian, Egyptian, Turkish, and GCC forces will never go back. There'll be regime change, as I covered in the beginning. Then we'll get the resolution between the African countries, the GCC, BRICS, rare earth minerals, everything falls into place. So this is why Trump has essentially been the best thing to the financial industrial complex of the proof of weapons network, because April the 2nd was, through tariff policy, about liberating the world from the dollar. And that means you need to adjust, you need to understand what's happening, and you can get some additional leverage by destroying reputations through the media networks that we're seeing right now. But it doesn't change what is coming to the West. You know, military, if it is exiting Middle East, it needs to make up for lost profits at home and in the Latin American, European region. And so that's why you're seeing everything that you're seeing with the civil unrest campaigns. So with that in mind, we have covered part 1 this week in Bitcoin, part 2 this week in macro, part 3 this week in geopolitics. And now we're going to go to the final section, part 4, enjoy yourself, where we're going to do a live air of an interview that I gave last week or the week before. I can't remember. I think it was the week before. Time is flying. And it was an interview with Danny from Capital Cosm, a YouTube channel. I'll just go through what we covered in the interview. So if you haven't watched it already, then you can enjoy it. And then we're going to end up, and that's going to do everything for Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 104. What is the real meaning between the US-China trade deal? And we covered this week in Bitcoin macro and geopolitics. Okay, so part 4. In the interview, I covered how in the next 5 years, I'm predicting 200 years of change that everybody needs to prepare them for. For those of you that are not familiar with the intricacies of the proof of weapons network, how it relates to the financial, technical, military, consumer, debt-based Ponzi scheme, Danny asked some questions, so I went deeper into that. I then covered also, some more details about the controlled demolition of the dollar in the United States and the currency war. We went through the manufactured wars and how they actually profit from it. We did updates on the Ukraine, Venezuela, and Gaza situation, made some predictions that later came true as well. And we go through deeper into BRICS and GCC and how they're utilizing de-dollarization in partnership with the financial industrial complex. I went through the real Trump agenda, where this ends, where this goes next. And I went deeper into the K-shaped economy, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and how that actually works and how to protect yourself with assets. Deeper into the surveillance state, what to expect, how the rollout's happening, Palantir, digital ID in the UK, artificial intelligence. And I left everyone with where I'm going to leave you at the end of this interview, which is how to put together an escape plan. I hate to tell you the things that are happening without giving you a plan. Remember, the fall of one side is the rise of another side. I want you to always stay on the right side of this change. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do well. I want you to stay on the right side of the change. So we'll move over to the interview. I'm just going to put it on the screen. I want you to make this transition with peace, love, and unity. And that's going to do it for me for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 104. But enjoy the interview. We're going to play it right now. And I'll be seeing you next week for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 105.